Our first plenary session is entitled Equality, Innovation and Resilience, Building Societies of the Future. For those people who are a little bit crammed at the back, you may want to take some of the spare seats around these tables, so feel free to make that move now while we're introducing people. Okay, this session draws together ideas about sustainability, global change and human behaviour. Speakers are invited to examine and imagine the kinds of knowledges we will need to create healthy societies in the future. When it comes to well-being of both people and their planet, are we facing only risks or are there opportunities? The chair of this session is Peter Sandeman, the CEO of Anglicare South Australia. Peter has recently been appointed CEO of that position. For the past 3 years, Peter has been CEO of Anglicare New South Wales, New South Wales West and the ACT. He has a long history in the non-government sector and has held senior public service positions. He retains a strong commitment to building human, social and economic capital in disadvantaged communities. I'll ask Peter to introduce his team. Peter Sandeman.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Now down to business. We've got a formidable panel for you this morning, and the batting order has been changing as we were just preparing there. I have to report a late scratching. Professor Lynda Anderson has succumbed to a part of his human dimension. He is unfortunately indisposed and won't be able to join us today. One of our other speakers, Lynda Ford, is struck by the lurgy, and we're going to put her on last to see if the voice recovers in time, or perhaps she's been sufficiently provoked by the other panellists to want to say her piece. Now let me introduce the panel to you. Before I do that, I just want to say that there is some convergence happening here which I think is very productive. As a person who's come out of the non-government human service sector, it's very important to us in our sector that the kind of ideas and discourse that HAS promotes and in fact is the crucible of discourse in our community. It's very important to us that what we do in our sector is underpinned by the ideas, the commentary, the facts and the philosophy that comes out of this sector. You're very important to us, you're part of our foundation. So it was very pleasing to be asked to chair this panel. The theme of this two-day event is, as you know, the human dimension, and the 4 speakers, or maybe 3.5 speakers in this session, will be offering insights on the human dimension in social innovation, environmental change, health and identity politics. Now I'm going to ask each of our panellists to speak for about 10 minutes. At the end of the talk I might try and provoke some cross-discussion, and then at the end of their presentations it'll be over to you to respond. It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment in this particular environment as well. Let me introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be facing you. Waleed Aly is a broadcaster, author, academic and musician who regularly appears on radio. Those of you who drive home to Radio National will recognise the dulcet tones of our first speaker, and he also appears regularly on television to talk about big ideas. He's a lecturer in politics at Monash University. He works in their Global Terrorism Research Centre, and his social and political commentary has produced an award-winning book and multiple literary shortlistings. Today, Waleed will talk about how globalisation has created a range of identities for citizens, and that migration and other trends have created for some a radical separation of identity and geographical location. As a Japanese American brought up in England and adopted in Australia, I'll be very interested in your interpretation there. In view of these changes to global and local society, Waleed will discuss how we create social cohesion and whether diversity is an achievable ideal. Our second speaker is Professor Tony Capon. He's Head of Discipline of Public Health at the University of Canberra and a visiting professor in the City Futures Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. He's a public health physician with expertise in environmental health and health promotion, and he has extensive experience at the research policy interface. Today, Tony is going to be looking at the emerging concern among epidemiologists that our children may not live as long nor as well as their parents do. Some of us would think that's justice for adolescents. Tony will argue that to respond to contemporary epidemics of obesity, depression and anxiety effectively, we will need to reimagine and redevelop the places in which we live, work and play as a healthy human habitat. Our third speaker is Dr. Mark Stafford Smith. He's Science Director, Climate Adaptation Flagship of the CSIRO and has an extensive career in the ecological sciences and beyond. Most recently, he was co-chair of the International Global Change Planet Under Pressure Conference in London in March 2012, this year, in which he worked to encourage the integration of natural and social sciences with the humanities in the lead up to Rio +20. Mark will be looking at the various global changes issues in the world today that demand input from the humanities as well as the natural and social sciences. But when we move from disciplinary to multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary approaches, we incur increasing transaction costs. So the question Mark is asking today is, when is it worth invoking these approaches? Our final speaker this morning is Lynda Ford. Lynda is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Community Workers Association, and she's been a social innovator, strategist, inventor, activist and passionate community worker for almost 25 years. In the normal course of event, you do bump into people, and Lynda and I spent some long hot summers working in northern Adelaide, she in defence industries, me in economic and social development in that community. So she's got a lot of background. Lynda will be drawing on her extensive experience to look at the question of social innovation. While creating a truly equal and resilient society requires social innovation, how do we measure it? And what can we learn from examples of poor innovation which have created such damage to individuals, families, communities and society? So we have a very broad panel. We have a quality panel, but the topic is very diverse. So it's going to be interesting to see how we can knit that together this morning. I'll have a feeble attempt at that as your chair, but without further ado, let me ask Waleed to take the to lead us off.
Thank you. Right, 10 minutes. Good, that'll be easy. I was actually really interested to listen to the comments of Senator Brandis earlier, in part because I agreed with so much of it. Although I do note that Karl Marx has been dead for a long time, but how you reconcile that, I left to you. But I do think there is a central idea that is really important here for us to grasp, and when it comes to thinking about social cohesion in contemporary society, I think it's a very important idea for us to grapple with, and that is this central idea of the conceit of modernity. That there is something that is inherently better about modernity than pre-modernity, or perhaps post-modernity is better than modernity, or however you want to categorise it. And that what's allied to that is that there is simply one way of being modern. That there is nothing more really for human beings to do than to perfect their modernity. We all know what that means, and it's really just a matter of going about realising that fact. And this, I think, this central conceit is probably the greatest problem that we have in trying to understand the contemporary world. I'll flesh that out in a moment, but the starting point, I think, for grounding that out is recognising that as a species, we are actually at a point that is highly aberrant in human history, that presents unique challenges that we've never met before and that we've actually got no history of demonstrating we can meet. And that is a challenge of hyperdiversity. We have, I think it's uncontroversial to say, the highest levels of migration in human history from the furthest reaches of the planet. But that more than that, our diversity is not simply a phenomenon of migration, and that we make a terrible error if we assume that that is simply the case. That but for migration, there would be no diversity. I would argue that actually, with or without migration, we would be facing a social environment that is hyper-diverse. And the reason for that is that the tools for identity construction, and ultimately diversity is about having a multiplicity of identities. And even identities to do with ethnicity or race or religion are ultimately, they collapse back onto this phenomenon of identity. We have difference, we have diversity, because we choose to recognise that difference in ourselves and in others. And we erect barriers, some artificial, some not, and we express and deal with diversity on the basis of what it is that we recognise. And because of that fact, because of the centrality of identity to that diversity, we face a difficulty, I think, in contemporary society, in that the tools for constructing our identities are more available to us than ever and lead to a greater diversity than ever. This is partly a phenomenon of global media that allows us to self-select the kind of news that we want to take in, the kind of issues that we want to engage with, and the people and the causes with which we want to identify. That no longer is who we are bound up so tightly with where we are. It's entirely possible now to grow up in Australia and never have left Australia, but engage with the world entirely through a prism of non-Australian media. It's possible to do that, and increasingly people are doing that. Now, I'm not saying that's a majority of people. One day it might be, but it's far more possible than once it was. And so, with that, identities that once upon a time found it difficult to survive in a geographically bound real world suddenly can survive in sometimes inspiring and sometimes frightening ways. You need only consider the multiplicity of global identities that are available to people, whether they be environmentalist or they be ultranationalist. That's one of the great ironies of our world, is that the anti-globalisation movement is amongst the most globalised movements in the world. That you have ultranationalist movements which have for so long been bound to a sense of country and a sense of territory that have themselves become globalised. And here, unfortunately, I could cite as an example the emergence and the strengthening of white supremacy around the world, which has been given a huge fillip by the phenomenon of globalisation. That there is now global trade in white supremacist goods. There are global white supremacist communities that may be trying to claim some element of a particular nation state, but ultimately transcend that in their politics and the way that they operate. And so what I want to say about that, and what I want to say, where I want to say that ultimately leads us, is an observation that goes back to this point about the conceit of modernity. That we are not embarked through globalisation on a project that has an endpoint, that says that we are on a unified path as a species, a global species, towards some kind of realisation of a perfect modernity. That globalisation is not, as indeed many of its critics would claim, a process that leads us towards homogeneity. In fact, it does the precise opposite. Rather than creating a confluence and a coherence of identity that is global and upon which there is consensus, actually what we see is a complete fracturing of identity. Yes, global identities are created, but so are hyperlocal ones. So are subnational ones. And so what breaks down is any kind of consensus about the nature of our identities as people. This has been described by various social scientists particularly interested in the sociology of globalisation. And here I'd cite as an example Zygmunt Bauman as an era of coexistence. But coexistence war is a form of coexistence. You can't fight someone with whom you don't exist. It's that we cannot escape each other any longer. We cannot retreat into human islands. And so this coexistence is not a neat, ordered process. It's actually what Bauman describes as a new sociology of entanglement. We are forever entangled in each other's lives, in each other's businesses, in each other's identities. And we cannot escape that fact. And that unleashes lots of exciting possibilities. And it also unleashes a great deal of social instability. And in some cases, terror. So as you have these new collectives that can form in this context, the new possibilities of fragmented identities that present themselves, what I've described as the radical separation of geography from identity, this idea that where you are is not who you are, which I think is well illustrated, and here you'll have to forgive my academic bias as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about terrorism and teaching in terrorism studies. But think, for example, about the London terrorist attacks in 2005. Young men, largely Pakistani extraction, largely British born, one exception to that, a migrant from the Caribbean, who grow up in the UK and perpetrate an attack against that nation, radicalised in large part by a war in Iraq. We have no way of understanding this kind of behaviour and this kind of identity politics through old prisms of collective identity which were based around the nation. We actually can't come to terms with it. We can't grasp it, which is why we ask questions about how it's possible that Pakistani British kids could care about a war in Iraq, or at least be moved to that extent. Because we're understanding them almost exclusively through national frames. And this is the great challenge, I think, that befalls us as a society, particularly as a national one. And that is the breakdown of the concept of a national identity. In an age where the national identity means less and less to more and more people, and therefore, in an age where national identity has to be asserted more and more, particularly from government. That once upon a time, national identity was spoken of almost in a descriptive way. Now it is not simply that. It's urged upon us. It's almost like a plea for us to hitch ourselves to this national wagon that has less and less claim over our lives because of the multiplicity of possibilities that we now have for the way that we choose to identify. And this is, I think, a great challenge for Australia, and something that Australia is in not the worst position to deal with, but a very challenging position to deal with. Because, broadly speaking, and I'll finish on this thought, there are two ways in which national identities can be constructed. One is what I'll very broadly call the European way. A series of national identities based upon a mythology of homogeneity. That is, that the moment the nation state was created, that when the nation state and state sovereignty was precipitated after the treaties of Westphalia, a mythology arose that said that within these borders there is a homogeneity, and there is an essential difference between people within these borders and people within those borders. That there is something about being German that is inherently Germanic, and it's definitely not being French. And it's certainly not being British, and it's not being Spanish. And these are essentially different categories that are characterised by ethnicity, language, culture, religion. This was always a fiction, It had to be brought into reality, and often it was done so brutally, as anyone who surveyed the terrain of Franco's Spain in the 20th century could tell you. The suppression of minority dialects and the suppression of diversity to create that homogeneity, but it was essential to create a national identity in that European mould. Or there's the New World mould, most quintessentially reflected in that of America, which is not at all a national identity based on ethnicity or language, but it's a national identity based on a civic idea, that idea being the idea of individual liberty. Anyone can buy into it. It doesn't matter what language you speak. Indeed, when I was in Miami a few years ago, I found it very difficult to order at a Pizza Hut because I spoke English rather than Spanish. But it's a deeply American city, partly for that reason, because it's based around a civic ideal of the collective. So my question for Australia is, in globalising circumstances, given what I think is the very obvious failure of the European model of national identity in an age of hyperdiversity, given that it's a national identity that's simply not adapted to deal with diversity, what of Australia? How do we articulate Australianness? And how do we go about articulating Australianness and Australian identity in a way that will facilitate cohesion when so much of our discourse about what it is to be Australian emerges either at moments of sporting triumph, which have become increasingly thin on the ground, or at moments of social fracture and crisis? That when we see protests take place in Sydney, for example, our response is to declare them un-Australian as a way of affirming what that national self is, which really camouflages the fact that we have less and less compelling ways, or fewer and fewer compelling ways, of articulating what that Australianness is at times that are not moments of crisis. And therefore, we find it harder and harder to articulate an Australianness that is not about exclusion. It's one of the great challenges of a hyperdiversity, to articulate a national identity that is coherent, that is cohesive, and not exclusive. That is nonetheless the challenge before us. And I'll leave that challenge to be picked up in questions if we have time.
I'll just give the opportunity to other panel members very quickly to see if they wish to pick up any of those challenging themes. But because of shortness of time, we'll have to move fairly quickly through the panel. Anybody want to pick that up?
I'm interested, Waleed, what do you think the role of the media ends up being in all of that, because it's such a key player in those aspects of globalisation and identity?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, but I think embedded in the question is the difficulty, is it depends on what media you mean. And this is part of the problem, is that once upon a time a national media was comprehensive, and we had a national conversation and a national sense of self based on the fact that we had a shared media, and that more or less put boundaries around the discourse we were having as a nation. What do you do in an era where media is not geographically bound, where you are more and more in control of it? And here it's a really interesting phenomenon, because as someone who works in a media organisation, I feel every day the dominance of that Westphalian frame. I feel every day the dominance of this idea that we are having a national conversation. When the Prime Minister of Australia says something, we will pay attention. When the Prime Minister of Great Britain says something, less so. When the Prime Minister of India says something, well, almost certainly not. The question is, though, does that sort of established traditional mainstream media become less relevant to an audience that has broader interests? To pick a really simple example, that has sporting interests beyond the Ashes. That feels conflicted when the Socceroos are trying to qualify for the World Cup. I'm sorry to keep referring to sporting things, but they're easy to latch onto. And so this is, I think, partly why you see an increasingly diverse audience fragmenting, because who has it got to latch onto? And it's got so many more options. If it wants to engage in through the prism of satellite television that doesn't take Australia as the centre of its frame of reference, it can do so, and that's difficult. So the challenge for mainstream media, I think, is to try to present diversified content that breaks that national identity model, and I don't think it's very good doing that, which is a problem.
Thanks, Waleed. I really enjoyed your comments, and it got me thinking about another thing that defines our times, and that's the Anthropocene. This is an era in which human beings are changing the planet, changing the underlying planetary ecosystems. And there's another thing here that we all share. You know, our health and well-being in now and into the future is entirely dependent upon those healthy ecosystems. And I just wonder whether there is an opportunity in that context for us to understand that, you know, we have much in common because we're all members of the one species, and it's relevant to this other defining issue of the time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. But what I would say about that is I think that's one available way of dealing with this. And whenever you get that kind of response, which is, I don't even want to say an internationalist response, because it's not about nations, it's a more globalised response and a globalised identity. And environmentalism is especially ripe for that, given that it's inherently global. Global warming is not a national phenomenon. Every time you have that kind of response, because of this fracturing of identity that I talk about, you actually also get the counter-response, which is hyper-parochialism. And we don't talk a lot about these phenomena, but they're there. I mean, there's a very strong secessionist movement in Texas, for example, that has members of Congress supporting it. And not just, you know, cranks on the internet. I'm talking about this is actually a growing thing. So the question is, as the challenges globalise, how do you resist this human tendency to collapse back on the parochial as a way of providing security, because it's what we know. And the global is a much more difficult thing, I think, for us to grasp. Yeah.
Thank you. Waleed, can you just comment on the Australian public policy of multiculturalism versus, or as well as the, I guess, the current discourse on interculturalism?
Well, this is difficult because I think multiculturalism is something of such contested meaning that it becomes very difficult to have a coherent conversation about it. And I think that's partly why you have now a parade, really, of European leaders declaring it a failure, in spite of the fact I would argue that the Europeans have never really tried it. And where they have not demonstrated they've been very good at it. Historically, I mean, you know, there are always going to be exceptions. And even within Australia, I think the record is patchy, and here I'll be parochial in my own right, and so I think Melbourne, for example, is much better at it than Sydney is. And I think there are inherent reasons for that are structural, to do with the way that Sydney is set up as a society and the fact that it's a much more enclaved society. Even before multiculturalism, it was more enclaved. And Melbourne's flat and boring and doesn't have much water, so people get around a bit more, you know. So there are sort of things like that. As for Canberra, I'll leave you to decide whether it's flat and boring enough to facilitate that. But I would say that there is another discourse, and the American discourse is interesting on this, because America has no need for a discussion on multiculturalism. In the European imagination, there is either multiculturalism or monoculturalism, really. In the American conversation, there's no need for a conversation about multiculturalism because the conversation is about individual liberty. And that includes the right to your own cultural determination. I mean, the idea that in America, a government could tell you what your values should be. And I don't mean values like a commitment to freedom. I mean values like how you govern social relations within your community, how you govern gender relations, for example. No American government is going to be in a position to tell its people what its values will be. In Australia, we have that conversation very easily. You'll remember the citizenship tests that we introduced. You'll remember this idea, we have Australian values, and that means you have to learn X language being English. You have to know certain things, preferably involving Farlap or Don Bradman, and this is how we will create our sense of who we are. In a civic society like the United States, how can there be a conversation about multiculturalism? That is, it's not the state's position to talk about you in terms of culture. It's the state's position to talk about you in your capacity as a citizen. I think in Australia we're in a difficult position because although we are probably the best at multiculturalism in the world, we don't like that situation. We need to look somewhere else for an example. And I don't know that there are any other examples. So it's a very tricky situation for us.
We could spend all day on this, couldn't we? But we do need to move on. I will tell Waleed that it is important in Canberra as to whether you live on the south side or the north side of the lake, and those Southsiders are really, really not worth bothering with, actually. Okay, now our next speaker is Tony Capon, and Tony, take it away.
Just as those slides are coming up, I guess I should acknowledge that I couldn't let you get through to morning tea without some PowerPoint slides. You're in a university after all, and it's one of those modern technologies that can be helpful but may not be. So I've got about 10 slides to just very quickly walk you through, and I will try and keep pretty strictly to my 10 minutes. So this is my primary message this morning, is that low carbon ways of living are healthy ways of living, provided we tackle and address effectively potential inequities in this context. Let's think about what's happening with Australian health. Here is some data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare on life expectancy since 1998. And you can see that for Australia as a whole, life expectancy for females and males is currently continuing to increase. You can see there as well that there's a very significant gap between the life expectancy for the Australian population as a whole and the life expectancy for Indigenous males and females. What's happening with obesity as well? Since 1980, the proportion of Australian adults who are obese has been increasing quite staggeringly, to the point where now more than 20% of the total Australian population are considered obese. And who's obese? If we look at segment the population by socioeconomic status, we can see that obesity rates are much higher among the most disadvantaged communities in our society. And what are we spending on health? Here, the health spend in Australia as a proportion of total GDP. You can see that was about 8% of total GDP at the year 2000, increasing now to around 9%. And you can see that it's picking up pace in the last few years, a time in which GDP as a whole has been increasing quite substantially. So we're on a trajectory where we're not as well as we should be, and we're spending a lot in this sector. If I change gears though and think about our health in the context of the health of the planet, then we know that climate change is affecting our health in Australia already. People are dying in our floods, in our bushfires, in our heat waves. We're seeing changes to the distribution of mosquitoes in Northern Australia, with increasing frequency of cases of dengue fever and other mosquito-borne diseases in the cities of Northern Australia. We're also seeing flow-on consequences from climate change, with changes to agricultural productivity during prolonged drought, leading to declines in incomes in our rural communities, affecting the health and well-being of farmers. We see increasing rates of depression and suicide in our farming communities in periods of drought. So that's the downside of climate change and health. But as you can see from this slide, there's an upside that's very relevant to the theme of this session. There are health co-benefits from the sorts of changes we need to make to tackle climate change. Here are 4 examples. If we transition from coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe and the Hunter Valley to renewable energy generation in Australia, there'll be less toxic emissions in those valleys and people's health will improve, provided there is a local economy in those communities and there are things for people to do and ways to earn a living. So we need to invest for economic development at the same time as we're transitioning to renewable energy. From the mobility point of view, in our cities and towns, people will be healthier if they get around by walking, cycling, using the bus and train. It's less greenhouse gas emissions from that transport, and it's better physical and mental health. From the point of view of food, a vegetable-rich diet, better for health, less bowel cancer, for example, better for the environment because it's less greenhouse gas emissions to produce that food. From a housing point of view, housing that's well-oriented, well-ventilated, well-insulated, protects the health of people living in that place and less greenhouse gas emissions from heating and cooling it. And these themes have been explored in a special issue of The Lancet, the leading international medical journal, and there's increasing evidence that we could be acting on this positive story. We mostly hear about negatives in climate change. The negative effects of climate change on our health and our way of life, the negative effects of a carbon tax and all its potential implications. But there are positives here, and we need to understand them. Understanding those positives can be as simple as this communication device from the leading Australian human ecologist, Stephen Boyden, a Canberran from the south of Canberra. This is Stephen Boyden's biosensitivity triangle. And what he's telling us here is the human activities, the things we do on a daily basis, everything we end up doing either individually or collectively can potentially have positive or negative impacts on our health and positive or negative impacts on the health of planetary ecosystems. The flow-on impacts from the health of planetary ecosystems to our health. Indeed, we could have arrowheads in both directions in this triangle, but for the sake of this conversation, I've chosen to illustrate them leading towards human health, either positive or negative. And indeed, Boyden goes further to identify the universal health needs of the human species. He categorises them into biophysical needs and psychosocial needs. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the diet we are eating, other potential biophysical exposures, and the psychosocial dimensions, an emotional support network, experience of conviviality, through to opportunities for creative behaviour, learning, recreation, spontaneity, and an absence of alienation and deprivation. So we all share these needs. We need those needs met to be healthy and well. And indeed, in recent years, I've been working very closely with designers and planners, including Lynda, who couldn't be here today, to explore how we can bring this understanding of human health and well-being into the way we design, develop and manage the places we live. Working with US colleagues, we've developed a manual for thinking about making healthy places, designing and building for health, well-being and sustainability in an integrated way. So moving forward, it's essential that public health folk like me, I'm a doctor originally by training, work more effectively with folk from other sectors. We need to transcend a disciplinary understanding of human health beyond a Western medical understanding of how health is made. Embracing alternate ways of understanding human health and well-being, whether they be traditional and Indigenous philosophies or examples like that human ecological approach I was speaking about before. I think it would be valuable if we developed a new narrative that aligns concerns about our health with concerns about planetary health and benefits from this positive story of the co-benefits for human health from action on climate change. My final point is that to be effective, we need to move away from the current political mantra of getting it right. It seems that every time we hear from our politicians, they're arguing that they're just about to get it right. We're going to get it right this time. And I think we need to acknowledge that we will make decisions every day and we'll get some of them right and some of them won't be. But the key to success will be to learn from what we do, to evaluate as we go, to reflect on what changed, whether positive or negative, and try and avoid often unintended consequences again when we make further decisions. So that's my key message. Low carbon ways of living are healthy ways of living, and to me that's a real positive that we can be doing more with in Australia.
Tony, thank you very much. We'll now subject you to the inquisition from your fellow panel members. Who wants to go first?
So Tony, drawing those two talks together a bit, what do you think? What are the implications of that if we're not wanting a national identity as a sort of fat, fair go?
Well, look, I do come back to my point earlier about the fact that there is something we share here, and it transcends a national identity. We are all animals. You know, we are part of the planet, and I think we aren't encouraged to think in that way. I agree it can be problematic potentially because you know it is an unconventional way of thinking about how we relate to people as well as other species. But I think unless we do that, we will continue to be too focused on our own needs, whether as individuals or communities, rather than understanding our place in nature.
I'd just like to pick up on your point about disadvantaged communities and obesity, and there would also be issues around smoking, heart disease, a whole range of other comorbidities. From a transdisciplinary perspective, how do you see that kind of issue can be resolved in low-income communities?
A key in Australian cities at the moment, and we see it coming through in some government initiatives, is the structural inequity in infrastructure across a city. If you look at a city like Sydney, if you happen to be fortunate enough to afford to live east of Parramatta in Sydney, then you will have access to historically good public transport, whether it be buses or trains. But once you go further west, to the north, to the south, those communities have been developed in a time when the motor car is perceived as the principal mode of transport in cities. And that means that the shape of those communities is quite different to the shape of the communities that were laid out and developed before the motor car, when we were using trams, trains and buses. And so unless we address that structural inequity in the mass transit, for example, unless we start building those railway lines rather than just talking about building them, as our politicians are very good at doing, and then 10 years later they'll change the route slightly. Unless we tackle that, come to grips with it, then we cannot possibly address the other structural inequities, the other inequities that arise, including the health inequities.
What was really interesting about the presentation was it placed the value of health at the centre of it, which is, given your background...
I am a health person.
Exactly, it makes perfect sense. But I just wonder, given that so much of our political conversation is not centred on health but is centred on efficiency, and given that so much of the change that you're talking about, at least in the short term, seems inefficient, driving is more efficient than walking or cycling, etc. How do you either change that or re-present it in terms of efficiency?
I think the driving example is a really good one, because at the moment in a city like Sydney, a car is the most convenient place to get from South Canberra up here to the university often. But one of my colleagues who's a human geographer at UNSW's Canberra campus here, he has developed this idea of effective speed. So when we're thinking about how quick it is to make that journey from South Canberra to North Canberra, we must think about the fact that we have to buy that car, and that car will decline in value. We have to insure it, we have to register it. And when you do those calculations, it turns out that the most effective way in terms of your valuable time is to cycle, to get from South Canberra to here. And the reason for that is that for most people, we're spending about a day a week to buy that car. So we're going to the office, sitting at that computer screen in a very sedentary way, getting unhealthy in front of that computer screen to pay for the car. If we actually threw away the car, we could take the day off work, spread that out through the week, and get all that incidental physical activity by cycling around Canberra. So it requires a paradigm shift, and it's about thinking what's in or what's out in the way we think about these questions.
We'll now move on to our third speaker, Mark Stafford Smith, and we'll have a quick panel discussion after that. Lynda's going to make a couple of observations, and then it'll be over to you. You've been very patient. Mark, off you go.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Let me acknowledge the country we're meeting on, and also actually acknowledge the youth in the audience, which is fantastic. Obviously a really important part of our future, but also, as it happens, I can see quite a few people are from Canberra Grammar School, where my son also goes, and I happen to know that today is bad tie day at Canberra Grammar because my son pinched all 7 of my ties to wear simultaneously.
They're all bad, aren't
they? Yeah, they're all bad, yeah. So I'm very impressed that you managed to turn up in apparently reasonable ties. I wanted to pick up on or elaborate a bit more on the issue of the importance, I think, of working across these different sorts of disciplines. And we've heard, I think, already, especially in that last little exchange there, some of the really important reasons why we need to try and do this. To step back to the sort of real global change issues that Tony's already touched on, and the idea of the Anthropocene, the idea that we as a human race are now affecting the planet in ways which previously has only been through geological forces. That's a very profound, I think, almost religious change in the way that we view how our planet operates, because it essentially says that it's no longer enough to make recourse to going further west or appealing to God to look after the planet. Ultimately, it's in our own hands to think about the future of the place that we live in, and we only know the one place at the moment. So issues like that are really profound ones, and behind them lie a whole series of global environmental changes beyond climate change. So climate change, I think, is intuitively obvious, changes in our climate, but the broader suite of global environmental changes include a host of other impacts, things like the way in which we're using our nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, and in places having over-concentrations of that, which cause anoxic zones that cause dead zones in oceans. The extraordinary degree to which we now manage the global water cycle, basically the freshwater cycle, we manage about 60 or 70% of it in dams these days, and so we have a huge impact on the groundwater part of that starts to create real problems in areas like the Indo-Gangetic Plain in India, where the groundwater levels are going down so much. So these and many other issues that one can raise, all of which sound like a litany of despairing horrors. But behind them, of course, lies a whole stack of human ingenuity. And the key issue is that the vast majority of those problems, when you start to think about them, can't possibly be dealt with simply by thinking about the natural sciences aspects of them. Just knowing that the water table is going down or knowing that we're using too much phosphorus in a particular place is not enough to engender the solutions for many of the reasons we've already started touching on. And so it becomes, I think, profoundly important to make these linkages across the different disciplines to think about what the solutions really are. Because behind many of them ultimately lie other aspects of our social and planetary functioning, or in a whole raft of different areas. Clearly issues like population, but far more importantly than that, issues of consumption, the sorts of topics that were just being touched on there. How do we actually think about changing our identity, not to just expect to consume more, not to actually have one less car. I've got one less car now, but I don't seem to be working one less day for some reason. But how do we tackle those sorts of things? How do we deal with the issues of equity, the issues of capitalism, and the sort of profound expectations of efficiency that sit underneath that, the issues of globalisation, which is such both a positive and a negative potential force, a real double-edged sword. In order to tackle these sorts of things, I think there's no way in which we can deal with this without having a much closer linkage between the different disciplines. And it is worth thinking about the complexity of how you actually achieve that. So, I mean, it's usually talked about in terms of this continuum from disciplinary science or disciplinary knowledge acquisition modes of whatever sort it might be, that's very focused in a particular set of theory and so forth, through the idea of multidisciplinary approaches where you have a team working on the same problem, but they're really just doing it pretty independently, to an interdisciplinary sort of approach where you may much more actively seek for interactions amongst that team so that you're doing it with some common approaches in detail, through to a transdisciplinary approach where I think you're trying to delve profoundly into bringing some convergence between the underlying theoretical approaches, epistemologies and other aspects of operating in those different disciplines, in order to actually create not just an amalgam of different theories, but actually some new theory that sits at the sort of hybrid interface of the ways of thinking there. And this is important because for many of these problems, I think we do have to try and move towards that interdisciplinary to even transdisciplinary approach. The risk to caricature multidisciplinarity is that you get something along the lines of what we just heard this morning, which is, I think, Tony describing how we've got increasing obesity, which presumably will bring down life expectancy, which will mean we'll die sooner and therefore contribute more quickly to knowledge in the way that George Brandis was talking about. So if we don't take care, that's possibly slightly caricatured, but if we don't take care to make those linkages across the disciplines appropriately, then of course we just possibly might end up with the wrong answer. What I want to talk about just for the last few minutes, though, is that the challenges of making those things work across disciplines is non-trivial. And so we do need to think about when it's worth invoking those transaction costs and when it isn't. I think as you increasingly move down that continuum from a sort of single disciplinary approach to things through to a possibly transdisciplinary approach, essentially you've got a whole series of additional transaction costs, certainly in the sort of academic sphere. Before you even do the research, you have to spend a lot of time as you get towards the right-hand end of that continuum thinking about how to work together, what the sort of language is, what the sort of common theory might be. If you start putting in grants for assessment, you've got all sorts of challenges in the sort of disciplinary way in which they get assessed, and even where you have funding in places like the ARC set aside to try and encourage interdisciplinary approaches, you still have assessments from disciplinary views which are challenged by the things which are necessarily on the boundaries and trying to challenge the core disciplinary things. So it's very hard to get the things up in the first place. During the doing of the research, you've got additional costs in trying to work together in all sorts of different ways there, but that's probably the easiest one to deal with in many ways. And then afterwards, in the suite of incentives that we have in academia at the moment, it becomes quite hard to publish in terms of finding journals with high citation indices. It becomes hard actually just to write the papers because it takes longer to actually write something as a group than it does for one person to squirrel themselves away and write something in their own disciplinary expertise. So there are a whole variety there of transaction costs which it's worth thinking about. And so I think we have to think really carefully about when it's needed to try and take on, when it's important to take on those transaction costs, and it's quite clear to me that there are issues where it's important, but there are also others where it may be that a multidisciplinary sort of approach or even a single discipline is quite sufficient for some purposes. In the sorts of some of these global change issues that I've mentioned, though, we really are trying to tackle these issues of prosperity and well-being, well-being without economic growth. I think this whole idea of the conceit of modernity brings in a real desire to bring history into that. I find myself agreeing with George Brandes here, but perhaps not for quite the same reason, which is that we do need to be able to recognise that the phase we're in at the moment is quite unique, but we can be in all sorts of other phases in terms of history, as he mentioned. But that means that we can change into the future into ways which we possibly haven't seen in the past. So bringing the ideas of history and past experience into that is partly to enable us to recognise that the fact that we've had the last 30 years in the sort of consumption-focused individualism that besets the world at the moment is not the only way that we can operate, and in fact we need to find other ways if we're to deal with the Anthropocene. So in summary then, let me just say that I think there are a series of issues which really need these this sort of linkages across the disciplines, working together in a variety of different modes. To do that can be quite costly, so we need to choose carefully the places where we invest in that effort to make it happen. And of course there are ways in which one can try and reduce those costs in terms of in all of those places that I just mentioned. You can think about ways to make it easier for those things to happen, as well as choosing when it's worth actually investing in that. Having said that, I think these areas often are some of the most exciting, with some of the best sort of hybrid vigour, to use a biological parallel, where some really exciting issues can emerge, and just the sort of things that were coming up in the last few minutes are examples of those. There are places where we can really try and tackle some of these major issues. And for me, at least, these are issues where if we don't try and make some of those linkages work, then the future of our children will be very much poorer.
Thank you very much, Mark. Again, are there other panel members who wish to take up some of that challenge? I think there's a kind of theme emerging here that I'll try to draw together a little bit later. Any comments? You're just going to support him, aren't you?
Yes, that's right.
I think once we dispense with the niceties, we can probably all acknowledge that because academics view the world through the lens of their specialisation, they often become worse and worse at viewing it any other way. And so there's this interdisciplinary thing, there's structural concerns, but what about at the level of the individual academic? Do you think there are ways that academics actually are going to be able to overcome this and work together in an interdisciplinary way where they actually do place value on other disciplines?
I think the challenge for that actually, I work with CSIRO, where I think in fact we have quite a lot of interdisciplinary work going on. It varies in its depth and quality, but there's a lot of goodwill to try and do that. And I think it comes around mostly from actually having a mission-oriented desire to have an impact, to actually be able to solve problems. So I'm not accusing all academics of not wishing to do that at all, but I think there are people who have very different views on that, and I guess it's my view, my hope anyway, that amongst the academic community there is some areas of research where it's entirely legitimate and sensible to continue doing it in a very disciplinary way, because it's the most efficient way to do that for those particular issues. But as one moves into these more complex and so-called wicked problems, I don't like that term because it makes them sound like they're just sort of naughty, whereas in fact they're pervasive and the ones we have to deal with. But when we do come into those sorts of areas, we need people of goodwill who are prepared to look beyond that and who want to actually try and work across these boundaries, because it is quite apparent that there are any number of systems reasons why tackling these complex issues from one angle just causes another problem to pop out from another angle. So I have hope.
I just had a quick question about collaboration and the skills that you would need as academics to be able to collaborate.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are well listed aspects of this. I could tell anecdotes, but I won't. Some of the key ones clearly are listening to other people's points of view, spending time to actually understand what the underlying theory and rationale and indeed modus operandi, way of actually gaining knowledge, which as was mentioned earlier is very different between the different sorts of disciplines. All of that's needed. I think ultimately though one has to be realistic, and we certainly see this in CSIRO, that that in the end the best teams work because there's a chemistry of some sort between people, and there's only a certain degree to which you can ram people together and expect it to work, which is probably partly coming back to Waleed's question there too.
Okay, sorry for my voice. I just want to make a couple of points because I'm aware that we're running very much over time. I'd like to also acknowledge young people who are in this room this morning, because I think this is a great exposure to our sector, to certainly the humanities, arts and social sciences as an overview to the discipline. I'd like first of all to talk about the Millennium Development Goals, and particularly to bring people back to those and the importance of them to create resilient and equal societies. There are some timeframes around that. Not all of them will be achieved, and in fact some of them haven't even been started on yet internationally. But it's an important place to start if we're looking at societies in terms of their inequality or their equality and their resilience over time. Secondly, to look at being somebody, I guess, whose role it has been to apply the knowledge that is generated throughout universities and in some ways vocational education and training facilities as well. Social innovation is a really important element of our sector and our disciplines. I guess I wanted to bring three things to bear under social innovation. Firstly, that it's not often a word that's in the same sentence as the word social. We hear technological innovation, scientific innovation, manufacturing innovation, but social innovation is not something that's high on the agenda. That's an important point for us, because if we didn't have social innovation, we wouldn't have the social protections that we enjoy in Australia and that other countries don't currently have, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region. Secondly, that over time, we've actually done some damage with those social innovations, and we need to be very much aware of that damage and of the kinds of things that we've done in the past to people as a result of innovating. Firstly, let's just bring to the attention of people the policies around Indigenous people right up until the 1970s and early 80s around what we did to Indigenous families and taking away children from their families. Secondly, we allowed children right up until the 1980s to grow up in orphanages when their parents were still alive. We brought children over from the United Kingdom as part of the child migrant scheme and allowed them to grow up in orphanages. The last thing that we did was right up again until the 1970s, we thought it was a pretty good idea to take children away from their mothers where those children are born out of wedlock. And one of the things that had happened with each of those three social innovations, because they were for their time, is that it has caused lasting damage to many, many hundreds of thousands of people in Australia. It's done that individually to people who were directly experiencing that particular state of being, but also to their children, their grandchildren, and to society through issues such as drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, to people whose life outcomes involve them with courts and criminal activity. And those social innovations for us are something that we really need to be keeping an eye on. It has to come from an evidence-based approach. It's going to be critical for academics to take a much greater role in evaluating and monitoring social innovation into the future, because we can't be allowed to think that something's a good idea to then have the kind of life outcomes that we have for people as we have in the past. Thank you.
I've been given the signal that we need to wind up. Never stand between an audience and their morning tea at one of these events. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things, wise things that have been said around this panel by the panel members. I think Waleed's rather apt saying that we can't escape each other in the new sociology of entanglement. It may be that's a way of describing the transdisciplinary approach, that it is a sociology of entanglement. When I worked in the Office of the North in South Australia to try and bring economic and social capacity building to a very disadvantaged community, and failed dismally, I might say, a very wise person said to me, and they proved right, I think, you've really got to understand why people don't want to work together. So in these transdisciplinary approaches, there are sometimes reasons why people really don't want to work together. Waleed, I think, very clearly demonstrated that it's going to be very hard for us to live and work together, increasingly as we fragment. It's not only that you have to take the AFL or NRL divisions in our community. To take your sporting example, we divide very easily. We don't unite very easily at all. But Tony and Mark, I think, have given us very cogent arguments that we really do need to work together if we're going to save the planet. So there's the kind of challenge that's thrown out to us, and whether we use the language of the healthy planet, our health and the planet's health being tied together, or there are other ways that we can identify which aren't national, they're not racial, they're not ethnic, but they're an identity of us working together. And that's going to be a very big challenge. The radical separation of geography from identity, I think we all feel that, particularly those of us who come from immigrant backgrounds. We actually feel that kind of tension between who we are and who we're kind of supposed to be, but we aren't really anymore. And so that kind of separation of identity and the inability to develop a collective identity that's going to work well for all of us. I really like Lynda bringing us back to the Millennium Development Goals, resilient and equal societies. It's a very big challenge for us all, isn't it? Even in dear old Canberra. Are we a resilient and equal society? Are we a resilient society? I think Waleed is actually questioning our resilience, and I think we can all question our equality. Thanks very much.